lots of people on the call, so I think that's the majority of those that are going to dial in. So we'll make a start. So good morning, everyone. Nice to see all of your faces. I'm going to present my screen and hope this works well for us. So bear with me just a second. Okay, so yes, so welcome and good morning everyone to our fourth virtual coffee morning. We are running a series of these at AccessHE and as part of the Uni Connect programme in response to the sort of COVID crisis and seeing how we can continue supporting our schools that we work with. So this morning is a really exciting session. We've got two guest speakers and we're really grateful to have them with us today. I'll just go through some very quick housekeeping points and then we'll do some introductions after that. So just click through. So yes, so there'll be lots of chance to speak this morning. We really encourage contribution. We want it to be a nice open conversation. So please do remember to unmute and either raise your hand on the Zoom function, or if you just want to wave at us if you've got a question as well, and we'll try and get through any questions. There is the chat function as well, and myself, Jerry, Taylor and Beth as the Outreach Hub will be keeping an eye on this and we'll be answering your questions as we go through, so do post those there as well. We are going to record this session, so just to make you all aware of that, and we can send these out, send out the recording and the slides afterwards as well, so just to make you aware that that will be happening. So we'll just run through the agenda very quickly today. Beth is going to give us a bit of an update on the week that was this week and the sort of changes that have been going on within education. As with everything sort of in this new world, there have been lots of changes. Everything moves at quite a quick pace, so we'll hear from Beth. We're also going to hear from Jane Carhill, really excitingly, who's the Head of English at Eltham High School in Greenwich, and recently wrote a really interesting piece in Schools Week, thinking about the role that bias might play with the centre assessment grades that are taking place this year. So yeah, really topical, and we're really grateful and excited to hear from Jane, so thank you so much. We're also going to hear from Dr. Jill Wyness, who is an Associate Professor of Economics at UCL Institute of Education, and we're going to hear about her research into the sort of why sort of predicting grades, the flaws with that, and hearing about her research as well. So good morning to both Jane and Jill. Thank you so much for joining us today. There'll be time for questions as well at the end. So yeah, we'll encourage those as well, so please do post your questions throughout. So I'm going to hand over to Beth first of all to talk through yeah, the week that was. So over to you, Beth.
Thanks, Michelle. Good morning, everybody. Lovely to see so many of you here, some familiar, some not. So I think we're going to have a great discussion. Firstly, I just wanted to do sort of an Easter roundup. So I hope you all had a well-deserved break. I'm sure it seems very much in the past now, though, after the week returning back to school. So firstly, the Oak National Academy, I've written here, a knight in shining virtual armour. I don't know if people feel the same way about that. So led by the sector, but backed by the government, the Oak National Academy is really a great educational resource for homeschooled students at the moment. It was launched just last week with over 180 lessons already from a range of academic subjects. The platform is proof that national collaboration in these times can bring a national benefit. So the learning resource features a host of celebrities already, including David Attenborough, Oti Mabuse, Danny Dyer, as well as lessons from 200 working teachers. The education package provides 3 new lessons every weekday, which include videos and activities for primary and secondary and post-16 pupils. Secondly, the free laptops sort of rundown. So to support this new online learning initiative, Gavin Williamson last weekend announced that disadvantaged children in England are to be given free laptops. So They, along with some 4G routers, began to be distributed out on Monday the 20th, according to the government. Schools and colleges will be able to also keep their laptops and tablets once they've been reopened, so helping children to continue learning even after the lockdown is lifted. Local authorities have been made responsible for distributing these to schools. The eligibility is on the presentation, but what about others? So those in education who are aged between 16 and 19 and do not have suitable devices or connectivity, they can apply for support via the government's 16 to 19 bursary fund. I'll be linking all of these in the chat later. So I'm aware that we do have a few local authorities in the call, Joe being one of them for Hackney. It would be great either if you could share now or on the chat whether how this perspective is from your end. Are schools contacting you? How's it going? Have you actually managed to get any laptops out so far? So yeah, any thoughts for that, and schools as well? It'd be great to hear from you about how that transition is working. Just a final point to plug the D4E consultation. It's still open. It will close on the 29th of April. They've already consulted sort of large groups of teachers, schools and college leaders, but they are always looking for more. So they've brought together a panel of experts on assessment and statistical experts and things like that, but I'm sure they're welcome. They would welcome all perspectives. So if you do want to contribute to that, then I'll also link that into the chat. So if there aren't any immediate comments on the free laptops initiative, then I guess we can move on to the next point, but I'll just have a pause there to see if anyone wants to contribute.
Just to say from Hackney, I don't have any information, I'm afraid, about us sending them out. I know we've told schools about the scheme. I was unaware that the LA was going to distribute them, so that message obviously isn't coming across in our newsletters to schools, because that's what I've been reading. But I can check and I can let you know at the next meeting. You know, there must be some people who are responsible for this. It's probably just not my department, but I can tell you that again.
That's lovely. Thanks, Jo.
Okay, so I will move us on to Jane then, if that's okay, Jane, to hear a bit about your take on the off-core grade process for this year. So I'll hand over to Jane.
Thank you for having me here. Real pleasure to be able to speak to you guys about this. I hear that message of change, actually, that things are changing, and there's a lot of change going on. I think what's funny about this topic is actually, in some ways, some things haven't changed. It's just become even more important this year because we're still grappling with the issue of predicted grades. That's obviously something that has been part of the system for a long time. But it is a nice time to focus on that and think about how that impacts some of our most disadvantaged students. I'll start a little bit about me. I've been teaching for about 5 years now. In fact, I feel a strong affinity with this group because all of my teaching has been in Hackney and Tower Hamlets until I recently defected to South London, where I now work at Eltham Hill School. It's quite a big week for us this week because we've got Stephen Lawrence Day going on. So a lot of our activities this week have been to do with that. So I might have to leave a little earlier because we marked that quite strongly here because we were very, very close to where he was sadly killed. So I'm working now in Eltham Hill. I'm the head of English there. Before I joined teaching, I was a program director at an organisation called DebateMate, and I worked there for a number of years. Hopefully some of you have been involved in DebateMate in your schools. And that's kind of where I started, I suppose, learning about the university admissions system, not as a student, but from the other perspective, coaching a lot of our students through the graduate program who are applying for kind of really top universities. And that's where I kind of realized there's a lot of barriers for those students, barriers that personally, I didn't have to face to the same extent. In terms of the article, the purpose of the article really was to start the process of really communicating, firstly amongst us as teachers, but really importantly to universities, from teachers what the issues are that we're facing and the worries and concerns we have about our disadvantaged students. The article itself is incredibly kind of simplified, and I really look forward to hearing from Jill potentially about how complex this issue is. The focus really for me was about those competitive university offers at this stage. So we know that obviously a lot of predictions are over predictions and under predictions, but where those are going to be a problem, I think, is for the most competitive offers. If those students miss those offers, then what are those universities going to do? I think the main concern I had when I was writing the article, thinking about it, was that universities might take these grades at face value, and might say, well, you know, the government has put in a really robust process, so let's take these grades at face value, let's consider them in the same way as we have considered any other set of grades. It was fairly early on, universities have said, look, we're not going to take them at face value, we're going to look at this in a kind of holistic way. But the question I then had was, okay, what specifically are you going to do that? So I'm sure many of us kind of in the group have already kind of looked at the Ofqual grade allocation process, kind of split into 3 bits, I suppose. Firstly, we have that initial teacher prediction, where they're kind of largely going to consider mocks, are going to consider classwork. And then we have the second aspect of it, which is going to be the joy of my life with 250 year 11s, which is ranking all those students from top to bottom, which with the GCSEs is a very different process to the A-levels. And I think that's important to consider when we're thinking about kind of universities and the application processes. And then finally, we have this statistical moderation. And I think there's been a little less on that from Ofqual, but we know it's going to take into account kind of national expectations of progress and crucially centre variability, which I think could be kind of an interesting issue for us to consider today. So if we're going to move on to the next slide, I'll just talk a little bit about teacher predictions. When considering teacher predictions, again, I think this is more about communicating to universities what teachers take into account when they make predictions. And it's important for universities, I think, to understand that these are, at the end of the day, still just predictions, because we're still assigning a grade that we think that student will get. That grade is not something that they got in a formal exam. And even though it is going to be kind of carefully considered and potentially considered in a very different way to what a prediction is, but there's not a lot of, we don't know much about what teachers are going to use when making these decisions. But what we do know about predictions already is that largely teachers do tend to use kind of a linear understanding of how a child is going to progress. Schools use that all the time. But we know that children with maybe initially lower attainment, who then make a lot of progress, are going to be harder to predict, and they have less predictable future attainment. So when we think about our disadvantaged students who might fall into those gaps, who might be maybe have lower attainment at GCSE and then get much higher grades, those, I think, teacher predictions there are going to be less reliable in that sense. And actually there's some quite good kind of Cambridge assessment. I've already done quite a lot on what goes into making teacher predictions. I thought that their articles and their research is really interesting, and I kind of linked those in the article that I wrote. I think we also need to think, when we think about teacher predictions, about the different incentives and different information and expertise available when we're considering quite competitive high-end offers. I do think that in private schools, there is a very strong incentive to make sure that students who have offers from the top universities get those grades. And now that we are in a position where teacher judgment forms at least 1/3 of that grade, and a lot more besides potentially as well. So we can expect that kind of those types of schools are going to be able to make those judgments with a lot more expertise than potentially schools nationally. I don't even necessarily think in London. I think maybe in London we have a different set of experiences, in fact. But I think nationally there are going to be schools where only 1 or 2 students are making applications to the most competitive universities, and their teachers might not have had a lot of CPD or might not have had a lot of information about those predictions and those processes. And I think so when those teachers are making those judgments, I think it's going to be much more challenging for them. So we're going to do the second bit about faculty centre variability. I'll talk a little bit about that, the next slide. So this is, again, because I'm just kind of a teacher and I'm not a kind of an academic and I don't have years of research in centre variability, but I kind of went to the data lab, and I've been kind of using data lab for a really long time now to kind of inform my own practice. And if you haven't actually used the FFT Education Data Lab, I do think they chunk down data in really accessible ways. So it's a really great resource to use if you don't already within your departments. And they're going to take into account centre variability, and they're essentially going to project, with their statistical moderation, they're going to project what kind of grades that school has had in the past and use that to moderate or consider the teacher predictions. We know that actually most predictions, especially for students actually on the lower end of the attainment scale, most of those predictions, so D's, C's, etc., most of those predictions are over predictions. So centre variability is really important to actually moderate. But when you get to the higher ends of the grades and more competitive offers as a result, actually we tend to be less generous for our disadvantaged students there. And the other problem is that if you are a student in a school that maybe hasn't had a lot of applications for mathematics, particularly university, if centre variability is going to come into it, how your previous school's results, the question there is, how are we going to see the impact on those types of students? The types of students that we're talking about, by their very nature, are outliers. If you're going to be one of the first, or you're going to be getting top grades, you're going to be a statistical outlier. So a moderation process that kind of considers a centre, is that how they're going to deal with outliers? Are they going to bump those down? Are they going to look at them as individuals? I think there's a lot that universities can do. I don't think there's a lot necessarily that schools can do to change the statistical moderation. That's the government process, and it's there for a reason. But A-level results are particularly volatile because we have smaller sample sizes. I'll leave that to professionals, but I do think that the data here shows that in smaller GCSE subjects, variability is much higher year on year. So it's much harder to predict the results that you're going to get. So if you only have 3 or 4 mathematics students or 3 or 4 English students, the change in results, the shift there, can be really big year to year. And we know that loads of sixth forms are in that constant state of improvement as well. So it's really hard, I think, to assess those. 250 GCSE kids in English, they're not necessarily going to vary year to year, huge amounts in terms of schools' results. But outside of that, I think there's a big question there for us to consider. So if we go to the last slide here. So this slide here, these were kind of some of the suggested strategies for universities and schools. I wrote the article because I wanted people in universities to read it, and I kind of asked a lot of people forward this article to people in admissions at these universities so that they can start to understand why these grades are going to be different to grades in the past. But I don't think it's just on universities. I think it's on schools and universities to get this balance right. And I think it's so important. Actually, Michelle and I were talking about the appeals process. I think that appeals process is going to be bombarded potentially in the summer. And I think we need to get ahead of it and start those relationships now and start thinking about what we can actually do. So first thing is, and I think this is why I wrote the articles, universities need to acknowledge the shortcomings in the system. That's not to say this isn't a good system or it's not fair at all, because it's actually quite a good system given the circumstances. But we do need to acknowledge the shortcomings and identify the students in particular who might suffer as a result of those shortcomings. I think we need to think of the appeal system as a last resort. I think the government has set it up to be used by loads of people, and that's great. But if we can avoid making appeals, and if we can reach holistic judgments that we think are fair, then I think that might be better in the long term, well, in the short term for these students. We don't want that many students having to kind of sit a formal exam in September, because they might not be able to take a year out or wait to go to university. So for universities and for us, I think we need to identify the individuals that we're talking about who might who have those particularly competitive offers and might suffer from teacher predictions. I think you'd be surprised sometimes in schools that teachers don't always know who has offers from what university, because we work in such large institutions, especially the kind of schools that we all work in. I might not know that this student who I think is great in English, but maybe I'm not going to bet on them getting an A star, but I might give them an A or whatever. I might not know that that decision is going to really affect their future, because they have this very competitive offer that they have to get. And I think making sure that we are all talking about that as teachers is key, and for sixth form leaders to take that into account. And I think universities as well need to get in contact with those students. Cambridge University have already started providing information for their offer holders, saying, look, if there's been disruption, keep a log of that disruption. And I think that's a really good model to start off with, where we can start saying, okay, what evidence can we collect? That's not doing extra work, because Ofqual have been really clear. Don't do extra work. Some private schools are starting to do that. I think it's a bit cheeky. We're not meant to be doing extra work, but we can collect good essays, right? And we collect things, especially in schools where things might be in someone's office, or a student might have their stuff at home. We can start to collect things together for particular subjects where we think those predictions are harder to make. I think as well, universities and schools need to develop a kind of a joint understanding of results previously in those subjects and how that variability might impact particular individuals, and make sure that universities have that understanding, especially if a particular department has rejigged their teaching and learning, has started doing new things, and they can prove that they are kind of been making progress in that subject. I think that would be really, really important as well. This is a new model, I think, for universities and schools working with this level of detail. But I think the argument I made in the article was that if we can build like a hospital in a week, I think universities and schools can build the kind of relationships to protect these types of offer holders. And yeah, that's kind of what I'd share.
Thank you so much, Shane. That was fascinating, and yeah, really interesting to hear some of those sort of suggested strategies. Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much for that, and thank you so much for giving up your time. I know you've got to head off shortly, and yeah, we're so grateful for you giving up your time when you're still teaching. You're still one of those frontline workers. So yeah, thank you so much. So we'll allow some space for questions now. I don't know if we've got any on the chat, or if anyone wants to unmute themselves and just go ahead with questions. I know I've got a few if people are feeling shy.
It's like my sixth form lessons at the moment. Any questions?
Okay, while we're perhaps waiting for those questions to come through on the chat, I think what you were saying about logging disruption is really interesting. Like you say, I think there are some people trying to bend the rules a little bit and try and submit work, which I know the government are taking quite a hard line on, and not being able to accept anything post a certain date. So yeah, I think in terms of thinking about contextual admissions and using that disruption and those key events in a student's sort of life, and using that from universities is really, really crucial. So yeah, I wonder, I suppose this is not necessarily a question for you, Jane, but I wonder how universities feel about that are on the call, and how they can start using that data. So it'd be great to hear from any HEIs on the call. Please do feel free to unmute. Hello, Lisa. Lisa, do you have a question? Oh, and I think Jo as well. Lisa, we can't hear you unfortunately, but I think Jo raised her hand. So Jo, you have a question?
Yeah, it's slightly sort of the next stage really. It's just that some schools have been pretty effective of working with students remotely, and they've got a lot of work done. I mean, hopefully Some of them have anyway, and the teachers have been amazing with putting work out. It's like once those students get to university, some students will have a much sort of bigger understanding because they will have had, you know, a term's work, which some other students might not have done if they're unable to do this work. And how are the students the university is going to cope with ensuring that those students they've admitted are able to cope with the coursework, given they might have some gaps in their knowledge. But that's more of a university question, I appreciate. So
I think that is a really good point. I would add actually that when taking into teacher predictions and teacher these kind of judgments into account, I think it's really important to consider who are the students that are going to be able to cope with coming in, having had kind of less support, I suppose, at home, who are the real independent learners and so on. And that those types of learners, we're probably going to need to evidence that in different ways. And I think if universities can be flexible, I think that's really, really helpful.
I think you're right. I think as well, this sort of links to what you were sort of saying about how some grades are actually more generally over predicted, and the sort of pressures that those students are going to feel when they're if they are over predicted, and being able to keep up with that work and when they're at university. I think the implications of this are going to be really far reaching, aren't they? And I think universities and schools will need to work together to try and support this year's cohort and next year's as well. So I think, yeah, really interesting points raised there. Are there any other questions on the chat at all? Or any other questions in the room?
Not too many, Michelle. We're keen to find out always from HEIs about their current contingency plans for 2020 entrance, but also I'd love to just ask schools about their own experiences at the moment. What have those conversations been about predicted grades that you know of, and what are the sort of attitudes insofar to those students? Is the off-call guidance clear enough? Are you a bit in the dark? Where do you need support, and what are those current conversations from your perspectives? We'd be keen to hear any.
Beth, do you want me to come in? Yeah. Hi, so my name's Stephanie Gibson. I'm Vice Principal at Lee Valley Academy in Enfield. I also oversee the sixth form at the moment as well, so sort of have a leading role in that. So I think for me, whilst they've been quite clear with GCSE and A-level, it's our BTEC we're still a little bit concerned about. The guidance is not obviously quite so clear there. So we've been sort of trying to do, I suppose, what we feel will be required, ensure that all units are complete, grades are in for those units, looking at predictions for the exams. The exam components, they won't be able to sit. I think, so we have a much higher cohort of BTEC students than we do A-level. So for me, our A-level, we only have just over 20 students on A-level programmes this year. So we have quite a small cohort. And I think whilst there's been more guidance on the A-level, and we were quite fortunate, we just completed a set of, we call them PPEs, but mock exams, literally just before this happened. So all of that, we've got all that data in now. So we're now looking at how we allocate grades. Some of our A-level classes, we're talking 3s, 4s, 5s, they're quite small. So in terms of some of the things that Jane actually mentioned when it comes to ranking, if you look back at maybe how some subject areas performed last year, it could be very different this year because it's a very different cohort and it's a very small number. So I suppose it's just, making sure that actually the A-level students have a fair chance to access the higher Russell Group, Oxbridge universities. I've got a Cambridge student, and Cambridge have been very good. They've sort of been emailing out information, but at the same time, for me, it's the BTEC, and it's how that's going to impact. I think that's where it's not been so clear at the moment, is certainly from the information I've been able to sort of gain.
Yeah, really interesting, especially with BTECs. They tend to be a bit more vocational in terms of examinations, a lot more practical. So obviously those really can't go ahead at the moment. So have you had much guidance on which syllabuses will be cut, or kind of how things will be amended?
No, and I think that's the same even for year 12 for me. because I mean, I teach year 12 BTEC myself, and my students can't complete units because of practical components. So mine's sport, so there's a huge practical element, and I think that's where we're quite concerned in terms of, certainly in terms of what sort of will year 12s and year 10s, really it's the same, but will they get any sort of grace in terms of not being able to complete all the work this academic year potentially? But certainly from year 13, for me, that's the area, you know, like I say, we've collated the information we think we'll need, but a lot of our students are, you know, wanting to sort of know where they stand as well, and what will they allocate, you know, can we allocate the grade just based on work completed and the predictions for the external exams, you know, but there are units pending as well, so not all of our courses were complete.
Right, really interesting. Jane, do you have any thoughts on that, on, you know, the more BTEC side of things?
Because my I actually haven't kind of taught kind of on BTEC or kind of been involved in many teams that are doing that, so I don't know too much about kind of how BTEC is going to be kind of allocated. I do think you make two really interesting points there, though, which is that there are sixth forms by their nature have such varied curriculums and such varied kind of are really varied providers, and it's interesting to say that, you know, a lot of your worries are going to be about BTEC. And that is going to be true across the system, where particular sixth forms are going to be focusing a lot of their efforts in the area that they work a lot of the time in. And a lot of schools, for the kinds of students that I'm talking about in my presentation, are actually geared towards, you know, Oxford, Cambridge, the top universities. And so they're going to be very good, I think, at getting this right, getting those relationships with those universities. But if you've got confusing BTEC advice, and if you've got kind of loads of other things to think about, I think it is a lot more challenging. And I think that's where universities need to step up and provide clarity for those schools, really clear direction about what they expect and how they're going to make these decisions. And it's interesting, I think the second thing you said there was really interesting about Cambridge is I'm getting the impression that Cambridge are ahead of the curve on this, and that they are kind of taking the lead, because I think they acknowledge that the students that come to their university are their offer holders and they want to get it right. I worry that a lot of other universities are becoming very concerned about international students and the hit to their incomes, and concerned about domestic students and everything else. And that the government hasn't provided them with a lot of clarity on that either. So they have loads of competing kind of concerns. And I worry that these students might fall through the gaps of all of our competing concerns at this time, and that universities need to step up with that.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your insights and contributions, Steph and Jane. I think we will move on to our next guest speaker shortly, but just to say thank you again, Jane, for giving it your time and sharing those thoughts. I think you're absolutely right about universities really needing to have a consistent approach with this as much as they can, and thinking about those more specific subjects and courses that sound like they're going to be impacted the most, actually. So that was really useful, and thank you so much. We'll share these slides if that's okay, and we'll share all the links as well so everyone can access those. But thanks again for giving it your time today.
Oh, thank you for having me.
All right, thank you. So I'm going to move us on to our next speaker now. So we've got Jill with us. Move the slides on. So Jill, if you're happy to unmute yourself and say hello, but we're so glad to have you with us. I'm really looking forward to hearing a bit more about the sort of the detail around the predicted grades and how that might impact this year.
Yep, so hi everyone, thanks very much for having me. Welcome to my living room, which is in Stoke Newington in Hackney, so another Hackney person here. So I'm Jill Wirness, and I'm the Deputy Director of the Centre for Education Policy and Equalising Opportunities at UCL. As the name suggests, we're interested in inequality, social mobility, life chances of disadvantaged students. We look across the life course, so we look at early years, schools, higher education and the labour market, but I'm particularly interested myself in higher education research. And that's, you know, what's led me to this area of looking at predicted grades. Now then, how do I actually make this go along? Does anyone know how I go to the next slide?
Hi, Jill. I'll move you along if you just.
Oh, you'll move me along. Oh, I see.
Give me a nod.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, great. So yeah, so I'm just going to talk quite briefly. Obviously, we don't have a lot of time. So I'm going to talk quite briefly today mainly about some research that I carried out in 2016, which was commissioned by UCU. And they were particularly interested in predicted grades and whether predicted grades were accurate and if there were any biases and so on. And that was part of their campaign to basically, they wanted to get, you know, they wanted predicted grades to be abolished. So it's kind of, you know, fast forward to now, none of us would have believed that we'd be in a situation where like predicted grades have become so important. So yeah, it's been quite a crazy time, I think we all agree. But yeah, so that research was commissioned by UCU, and I'm going to talk mostly about that. I'll talk a bit about the consultation as well. Jane covered it really well, so I won't go into too much detail, but thinking about what this all means for the consultation and what we should be worried about, I think. So next slide. So yeah, so the piece of research that I did with UCU was basically asking the question of how accurate are teachers' predictions of student A-level grades. We had to buy the data from UCAS. UCAS do not give up data easily. It's quite difficult to get hold of UCAS data, but they agreed to sell us some data. So we have aggregate data from UCAS, and we can see predictions and actual results, so we can compare the two. The key word in this bullet is aggregate. So what I actually wanted was the individual student, what subjects they did, what the grades they got, and then their predictions as well. UCAS wouldn't give us that. They would only give us the best three. So basically I'm looking at a student's best 3 total points and then what they were predicted as well. But again, best 3 total points. So it's quite a coarse measure of accuracy or otherwise that I've got. So that's an important caveat. And also there's lots of other things I can't do with this data, which will become apparent. I mean, the main thing is I can't identify what school an individual's at. So there's not a lot I can say about whether certain schools are better at this than others, for example. But anyway, on that, with all those caveats, I'll just show you briefly some results from that research. Great. So this chart is showing a comparison of predicted and actual A-level grades. So basically, on the x-axis is the actual A-level points achieved by students. The notes have kind of dropped off the bottom of on my screen anyway. But basically, what these points refer to is UCAS gave me the data in this fashion, where 3 A stars is 18, so an A star is worth 6 in this world, and I think it's an F or something is worth 2. So basically, you have the lowest attaining students at the at the left-hand side, and the highest attaining students at the right-hand side on the x-axis. So running from 2 to 18. And then on the y-axis, it's the average prediction for each of those A-level point scores, basically. So we're comparing actual and predicted A-level points. And the 45-degree line, the grey dotted line, would tell you if someone was on that dotted line, that would mean that their actual grades matched their predictions. So their predictions were accurate. And then the black line shows the actual relationship between A-level points achieved and predictions. So there's a couple of things to note on this slide. The first one is that there's a lot of over-prediction. So the black line is almost always above the 45-degree line. So in other words, students are generally over-predicted. So for example, you can see there that someone who actually scored 4 A-level points, which is someone quite low on the distribution, would have been predicting on average to get about 8 or 9 A-level points. So quite big over prediction. But the other thing that's really apparent from this chart, and it really fits in with what Jane was saying as well, is that accuracy seems to vary according to the eventual attainment of the student. So it seems to be much easier to predict students that are at the top of the distribution, the AAA students. And you can see the over-prediction, you know, is very much correlated with being at the bottom of the distribution. The low-achieving students tend to be over-predicted, and the high-achieving students tend to be slightly under-predicted, as you can see there. So those are two very important points, but that's one of the key findings anyways, that we see a lot of over-prediction in this data. So next slide. Thanks. So this chart is now showing the like who gets under or over predicted, basically. So I've got under and over prediction on the along the x-axis. So it's looking at the difference between the actual and predicted grades. So if you get a negative difference, that means you're over predicted. And so you can see here that if you look at the students that are extremely over predicted, so the -5s and -4s and so on, they tend to be students from the poorest backgrounds. And by the way, I'm measuring poverty using Polar, which is not necessarily a great measure of poverty, as I'm sure a few of you will know. But that was all they were giving. So that's all I've got. So yeah, so what you can see here is that generally speaking, students from the poorest backgrounds tend to be over predicted. And students from better off backgrounds are more likely to be more accurately predicted or under predicted. But that's not particularly surprising, because students from poor backgrounds tend to be the lowest attainers, and there's a strong correlation between your income background and how well you attain. So so there was a very, you know, so a lot of it's coming from that. It's coming from the fact that poorer students are lower attainers, and lower attainers tend to be over predicted. So what we really need to do, and what I really wanted to do, was to cut this data by level of achievement. So looking at the highest attainers, for example, do we see that disadvantaged students might be more likely to be under predicted, you know, just among those high attainers? So that's what I'm doing in the next slide. So we can just move on to the next one. Thanks. So this is some regression analysis that I did. I won't bore you with the details in the interest of time. But basically what I did here is I'm splitting the students into whether they're, you know, low achievers, so CCC and below, medium and high achievers, so AAB students and above. So if we concentrate on the fifth column, which is basically AAB students. So within those students, this is showing a comparison of, well, so the whole thing is the probability of being under predicted, basically. So the coefficient of 0.01 is a 1 percentage point increase in being under predicted of the poorest students versus the richest students. So in other words, what this is saying is that among the highest achievers, among AAB students, those from disadvantaged backgrounds are 1 percentage point more likely to be under predicted. And so that's what the sort of second key message of the paper is, that on the whole we see over prediction, but among the very highest achievers we see some under prediction, and those from disadvantaged backgrounds were slightly more likely to be under predicted, and they received slightly less generous predictions. Now, I'm emphasizing the word slightly because these effects are not huge. They're quite modest. And I think there's a tendency to get carried away a bit with these kind of effects. They're not that big, you know, but having said that, if you're that marginal kid, you know, it's going to be really unfair. And they do add up, of course, as well. You know, there's not a huge number of very high achieving disadvantaged kids, but still, you know, they're out there, and they could potentially be affected if we rely on teacher predictions. So those are the two key findings from my research, is that the vast majority of students are over predicted or have been in the past, and that there does seem to be a little bit of a small increase in under prediction for very high achievers from disadvantaged backgrounds. So next slide, please. So I wanted to, I've been obviously reading, as I'm sure we all have, the off-call consultation, and thinking about what this might mean for the consultation. I agree with a lot of Jane's points, really, which is that I think under the circumstances, the government are doing quite a good job here. They are in a difficult position. What can they do? And I think it's a fairly sensible approach, but I agree with Jane as well that there are definitely things that are concerning. So you know, as Jane said, this isn't all just going to be about teacher predictions. That's only part of the puzzle. They're going to do this class ranking, and then they're going to standardise the predictions according to the historical attainment of the school. So that should account for a lot of the over prediction that I see in my data. If a school, you know, over predicts everyone, and there would be, you know, potentially there's an incentive to do that, you know, that will be controlled for if we could standardise on the basis of the school's past results. My worry there, and that's something that Jane highlighted as well, and I completely agree with this, is about outlier students who do not, you know, like for example, high performing students at low attaining schools. Will their results potentially be dragged down by this standardisation process? On the other hand, some students could gain, so low performers at high attaining schools could gain. So there's going to be winners and losers out of this. And the devil is really in the detail here, I think, because we don't know the extent to which that's going to happen, because we don't have the fine details of what they're going to do. And they've said they're going to take the prior attainment of this year's students into account. So, you know, the question is how much they're weighting that versus how much they're weighting the historical attainment of the school, etc. And they might take into account characteristics of the school, like, you know, the SES mix as well, although that isn't super clear to me exactly how they're going to do that in the consultation. But yeah, my worries concern outlier students for sure. The other thing that's pertinent to the consultation is that they're not going to adjust for individual characteristics. So I've just, you know, presented my results showing that there's a modest potential for under prediction among high achievers from low SES backgrounds. As far as I understand, they're not going to do anything about that. For example, they could bump up everyone's predicted grade from a low SES background or from an ethnic minority background or something like that. My understanding is they don't want to do that because they don't want to interfere with the rank order, the class ranks, and that could effectively change someone's rank position. So they don't want to do that. I mean, I can see both sides, but that might be something that we might want to worry about as well. And I think Jane made some great points about what universities could be thinking about in this respect. So just on to the final slide. Yeah, so I said recommendations. I mean, these are thoughts. This is quite live, you know. And I like I say, I do think the consultation looked pretty good to me. I think the government have thought carefully about it. They're taking it quite seriously. I've been contacted by a SPADS about this, and I've had a conversation with the government SPAD about it yesterday. So they do seem to be listening to the concerns. I mean, the consultation is, you know, we haven't got a lot of time, so you know, there's a sort of time limit, but they do seem to be listening. But yeah, of course, it remains to be seen as to what they do. As I say, I think there's going to be winners and losers out of this. You know, people that would have been super good in the exam potentially are going to lose out, but I don't really know who those students are. My worry, as I say, is about untypical students compared to their schools. And there's still room for potential bias to impact students. So looking at my results, potentially some students from low SES backgrounds, if they get under predicted or if they get put at the bottom of the class rank or lower down the class rank than they should be, that could potentially affect them. So I think there is potential opportunity for universities to think about these issues when they're looking at these grades. And I mean, one thing is that, you know, there's still a lot of scope for using contextual admissions. Vicky Bolivar's work, etc., is showing that there's still a lot of universities that don't use them, or they're not used, you know, very much. This could be a good opportunity for universities to start thinking about students, maybe students that are untypical from their schools, for example, disadvantaged students, or high attaining students that are from a very disadvantaged school. That could be a really good flag for universities. I know some universities use that as a flag, but not all of them. And there's some good research out there that shows that if you're disadvantaged, if you're a student from a low attaining school, then you potentially your grade is worth more because it is harder to get that grade. So I think that could be something that universities could think about. I completely agree with all of Jane's other suggestions about what schools can do, and so on. So yeah, that's those are my thoughts. And that is my paper, if anyone wants to look at it, on predicted grades.
Thank you so much, Jill. That was fascinating, and there's been lots of comments on the chat and contributions and really thoughtful comments. Just a few things that stood out for me. I think, like you say, it's those outlier students and those students that are high attaining but go to or have lots of potential but go to a disadvantaged school. Although that's a small group, that's a group that we're trying to work with as the UniConnect team, and they're so important, and it's really important that universities are unified on this and have a really similar approach. And I think, yeah, the importance of contextual admissions just now more than ever is crucial in looking at that sort of distance travelled stuff that you're referring to, and how someone from a disadvantaged school, you know, that's incredible if they've achieved really, really well in comparison to someone that's had lots and lots of opportunities. So thinking about how the context of COVID and the impact and the disruption that that's going to have, it's so important. I think there are some people itching to ask questions, so if anyone wants to raise their hand or unmute themselves, I'll hand over to Jill.
Hi everyone, can I jump in here? Sorry. Hi. Amazing paper, thank you so much for that. I think my question is going to be quite predictable given we're in a London context, and I'm sure you've heard it before, but of course the use of Polar 4 data is really useful when we're talking about the whole United Kingdom, but less useful in the context of London. So just for people who might not know what Polar represents, Polar groups are, well, Polar group students according to postcode data. So that can be highly misleading when it comes to, say, thinking about Kensington and Chelsea, where you might have the most extremely wealthy against the most extremely poor. And my question is basically, were there any discrepancy in the data when it came to looking at predicted grades in London, or if there's any existing research about a London context for predicting grades, given the very unique demography that we have here?
Yeah, I think that's a totally fair question, and I completely agree about Polar. I mean, particularly in London, it's known to be quite inaccurate. No, as far as I remember, I don't think they gave me even the region that the students were in, so I wouldn't have been able to do this even if I wanted to. I can't answer the question at all. On the other research, I mean, there's so little research on this that I don't recall having seen any. I think it's a really interesting question. I mean, my dream would be to get the actual UCAS data, you know, with students, individual level students, their predicted grades, their offers, their applications, etc. But I don't have it. I don't know anyone else who's ever had it either, so I don't have a good answer to that. But I agree with you. I think London is very unique. Polar isn't right for London, so it might tell a quite different story, but I can't tell you what it is. I'm sorry.
Sorry, that was a bit of a stinger of a question. I think I'll follow it up with a bit more of a nicer one, which is basically, I think we've both papers have talked about prediction and problems with that. Your research seems to suggest that obviously the overwhelming amount of grades are over predicted, but could you clarify kind of what the actual dangers are in terms of over prediction, and how that might relate to what happens when we start the new academic year?
I mean, in the past, the dangers are that students don't make their grade, and so therefore they get an offer and they don't make it, and then they have to enter clearing and all the rest of it. But we're in very different worlds this time round. So I mean, the standardization process will probably deal with quite a lot of this. So I think there's less danger than there might have been in the past, because I think as long as it's sort of a school level thing that's happening, the standardization should probably take care of quite a lot of it. If it, if the government weren't doing that, we could potentially have a whole load of students that are, there are too many students that are qualified for university, and then the university has a difficult job trying to decide who to admit. But I think the standardization should take care of quite a lot of that. I mean, there's another question about students not being prepared for university, and there is research, mostly from the US, that looks at the sort of policies about admitting students. Usually, it's ethnic minority students, and giving them, a lower grade requirement. And the research actually does show that they are less likely to graduate under those systems. So there could be a potential problem as well with students having overinflated grades, and then they can't actually, they're not able to perform at university. But as I say, I feel I'm less worried about that, and the evidence is a bit mixed on that as well. It's not.
Thank you. It's it'll be interesting to see, and really important to monitor that this year, won't it? I think with those students that, again, said it before, but have experienced that disruption and then going to university, like making sure that they're really well supported, and acknowledging like this very, very specific and challenging situation. It's unprecedented to use one of those terms, but really interesting stuff. Are there any other questions from any of our attendees dialing in today that would like to ask you the question?
Yes, me again. Sorry, hi. That was really fascinating. I just wanted to ask. There was a comment on the chat while you were presenting, Jill, about someone's experience with giving predicted grades, a student applying through UCAS to a certain university, then receiving an unconditional offer, and then that being sort of, as a fail-safe, then when it comes to the exams, not doing so much work because of that safety net. I wonder, obviously, your comment on that, and perhaps if schools share that, it'd be great to hear from you as well. But also in the context of this, when international students are very unlikely to be coming over now to the UK universities. I think 60% of Chinese students are now no longer planning to enter in 2020 September. So in the context of that, and universities perhaps being sort of rocky with those admissions, would you say that there would be more predicted unconditional offers, than already awarded? And how does that relate to your research with predicted grades?
I couldn't say. I thought there was a moratorium on unconditional offers at the moment, so I don't think universities are allowed to give them out at the moment, I think, which I agree with. Actually, I don't necessarily think they're a great idea anyway. Yes. Sorry, what was the other part of your question about? It was just
the first part more generally. I guess previously with predicted grades and awarding unconditional offers, and that being maybe a factor into your research as well.
Yeah, I mean, I'm curious about it, really. I've always been curious about this over-prediction thing that I found, because it does, it does beg the question: what do universities do with these over-predictions? And I suspect that a lot of universities probably know that they're over-predictions, and so they probably, in a way, standardize them themselves. But again, it was not something I was able to get the data on, so I've never been able to see whether over-predicted students were, what happens to them when they don't make the offer and so on. Because perhaps a lot of universities will let them in anyway, or let some of them in. I think that's probably a question that's probably better answered by someone from a university, I think. Yeah.
And if there are any universities that would like to answer that, please do.
I think we're if there are Oh, Jo has her hand up. Off you go, Jo.
Yeah, just a quick one. I think London Council did some research about people, the success rate of people who were taken in to university, depending on, whether they got their offer grade. I can't remember the detail of it, but I know they did try. So it might be worth having a look at that on London Council's website, because that's quite a useful thing. And just to clarify that, yes, there is a moratorium on unconditional offers. I think the time period was extended very recently. I saw a Zoom meeting yesterday where Ofsted did a presentation, not Ofsted, UCAS did a presentation, and it's definitely been extended for, I think, till May.
Yeah, that was my understanding as well. Yeah.
Great, thanks so much, Jo. I think perhaps if one of us in the team can look into that London Council's research and share that as a follow-up to today, that sounds really interesting. So we'll try and find that and share that around as well. I'm conscious that we are beyond 11 o'clock and we could talk about this lots and lots and lots. So it's been really fascinating and engaging to hear all these different perspectives, and we've had a couple of universities on the chat talking about their contextual admissions and how it's a real priority for them, so that's great to see. And I think just more of that from universities this year, and putting that in place is going to be really important. So we will wrap up there, but just to say thank you again so much, Jill, for your insights and your paper, and we'll share around the links from your slides so people can look at that data as well. And just to say thanks to Jane, who's now teaching again and back in the classroom, but thanks to Jane, and we will share details of the next Coffee Morning as well shortly, which will be on the 8th of May. But yes, thanks again. If you have any suggestions for future Coffee Mornings, please do get in touch. But I hope everyone has a lovely day, and thank you again.
Thanks.
All right.
Thanks so much,
Thanks,
everyone.
guys.